During the midsummer, usually around the middle of July, me and a few of my good friends, Ryan, Kevin and Tommy, always made time to go up to Kev's family cabin, located on the Vermilion Lake, way up north in the forest of Minnesota. Throughout all of our young years, we would always go there, accompanied by Kevin's dad, and sometimes a few of our dads as well. Once we were juniors in high school, we felt mature enough and old enough to go to the cabin on our own, finally without Kevin's dad, or any other adult supervision. My friend's cabin is very remote and very little, based upon a very large island. Other cabins were on the island, but the next one closest to us was a solid half away at least, which you could get to by taking a man-made path around the island. I want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on the gravel road on the opposite side of the island and take his boat across the lake, about half a mile to reach the cabin. This lake's very huge. My mind always had a tendency to run around when I was sleeping there. The cabin was all on one level, with 2 bedrooms next to one another, a kitchen/living room connected, and a bathroom in the back of the cabin. There was always one window in each of the rooms we'd sleep in, with no curtains to them at all, so it was very easy to see outside to the woods and lake. And this is where my mind would run, as I always thought someone was peering in. They never were, of course. I had been to this cabin a dozen times throughout my lifespan, and nothing had ever happened, and the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now for the event. We usually stayed about a week, or 5 nights. On the 3rd night during the trip, when we were finally on our own, we'd set up a campfire and had been drinking beer all night. I don't condone drinking underage, but being the rebels we were, we happened to sneak some. We went out to his dock to gaze up at the magnificence of the stars and enjoy our buzz, when all of a sudden we heard something out of the water that sounds like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked out to the lake with curiosity, wondering where the splash came from. Thankfully the moon was out that night, which lit up the lake, otherwise it would be dark as black, as there were no city lights for miles upon miles. My one friend Ryan began to point out, saying, what the hell's that? After looking closely and finally spotting what he was looking at, the only way I can describe it is it simply looked like a head out in the middle of the lake, just floating about, staring directly at us. It was about 3/4 worth of a football field length out in the lake from the dock. There's no question that I could see its features. It had long black hair and very palish skin like a face, but I couldn't make out the eyes, mouth, nose or chin, as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair over it. I'll never forget that feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck, arm, they all stood up, and I was paralysed on the inside, ready to leave that moment. But we told ourselves it was just a loon, as these birds were very popular night drifters on that lake, and do their hunting late, and also have black with white colours on their coats, and hunt by diving deep in the water. So it was possible that a loon all of a sudden popped up in the water after hunting a bit, or at least that's what we tried to talk ourselves into. All of us having the creeps and noticing it wasn't moving one bit decided to go inside and drink more. I'd like to mention that there was a staircase outside my friend's cabin, about 8 stairs in length, down to the bottom where the fire pit was and the dock. We soon forgot about the head with the help of the beer, until I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the only one inside was preoccupied. I went outside to do my business, seeing as we were in the great outdoors. Whilst taking a pee and glancing at the beautiful moonlit lake, I noticed that that black circle object was still there, but about 30 yards closer now, still looking as if it was staring right at me. I could easily see the nose on the thing's face. Again, it was very pale, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went inside to tell my other friends to come out and take a look. They all came outside to see it, still there, looking at us, as if this head was corked up at us, with its chin in the air. Nobody dared go out to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside. For a loon to stay out in the same spot for an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring at us from the deck instead. There was no ripple effect at all in the lake where this object was. We said it was just a log and went back in. I could tell all the others felt uneasy too. A few hours would pass. It was super late into the night at this point, and we knew we needed to sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside one more time, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a tremendous sense of relief, thinking the log must have floated off, or just hit shore somewhere. There was no AC in the cabin, and we had to open the windows or else we'd fry in the middle of the summer. Me and Tommy slept in the living room, while my two other friends slept in two separate bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes shut, I began to hear someone walking around at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin. I thought I was going to shit bricks. No question who or whatever I heard down there was on the deck, pacing back and forth as if it made the sound of a boot clicking on the wood. It was as if they weren't sure of what they were doing with themselves. It lasted for about 3 minutes. Wanting to whisper to my buddy, but frozen in fear, I just kept my eyes shut and my ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 rapid steps up the deck stairs all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting down onto the man-made path. After it sounded like the steps were long gone and a couple of minutes had passed, I woke up Tommy and asked if he heard the steps, both of us sitting up. I was startled to see my friend Ryan walking out of his room and saying, "We need to leave," a minute after these steps had vanished. He must have heard us talking, so he felt like he could come out as well. Something was very disturbing about his expression, and I asked why. He woke up my other friend Kevin in the other room and said, "Let's go, get to the boat, it's time to go." Asking him what the hell was wrong, he explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff, and I'll never forget what he told us, and neither will my other friends. He said when he was turning sides on his bed to get more comfortable, he saw someone peeking in at the top right corner of the window, and it quickly shifted out of view. He said all he saw was one eye, pale white skin, and long black hair. When we look back at what he experienced, it chills us to the bone realizing that since the face was in the top right corner of the window, this thing was either 8 foot tall, standing on something like bricks trying to peek in, or it was floating. Ryan then continued to say, "Let's fucking go," very seriously. Absolutely disturbed the fuck out of our minds, and feeling like we were going to be sick, we all agreed and packed our stuff and booked it out of there. And as we headed down the stairs, we saw footprints in the dirt, heading off into the path, and all around the cabin. We picked up our step getting to the boat, not knowing what was around us or watching us. We threw our stuff on the boat, untied it, and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water anymore. My eyes were just glued on the island, trying to spot anything moving. But I saw nothing. When we finally got our stuff packed into the car, we hopped in and took off. After driving for about 10 miles, Ryan, who said he saw the person outside his window, all of a sudden broke down in the car, sobbing, saying, "What was it, guys? What the fuck did I see?" We called our parents to tell them what happened on the way back, and that Ryan was really freaked out, and they told us to get home quickly and safely. It was late, about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept and it was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, who owned the cabin, went up the following weekend and said he experienced nothing while there, but did mention footprints were still lingering about, which he thought odd because someone was walking around his property, which bugged him really badly. Whatever Ryan saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping multiple nights, and ending up having to seek help for a couple of weeks. As time went by, he ended up being fine, but isn't too comfortable sleeping next to a window without a curtain. To this day, I can't explain what happened and why it seemed to happen to us, nor can I explain what I saw in the lake, or what Ryan specifically saw. Nothing has happened to the cabin since that night, so we're told by my friend's dad, who owns it. I personally decided to never go back to the cabin, which really makes me sad because I had great childhood memories there. Tommy and Kevin have both gone back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to go back as well, and I'm with him. A lot of people have cabins on this island, so it could have been a prank in the making that got busted when Ryan saw the person at the window. Or maybe the person possibly wanted to do something worse. I'll never be able to explain what was floating in the lake. But the fact that this incident, along with the footprints and the person that Ryan saw in the window, all happened in the same night, seems like something more than a coincidence.
It's 1986 and I'm 7 years old. It's a Friday and I know that my dad is going to collect me from school. You see, my nan would collect me from school on Mondays through Thursdays as my parents worked long hours and they would pick me up from my nan's house around 6 or 7 p.m. On Fridays, my dad would finish around 2 in the afternoon and collect me in his car. I loved Fridays after school. Me and my dad would drive straight home. I'd change into what my dad called my scruff kit, and then we'd grab Oscar, our dog, and take him for a walk in the park, which was 3 streets away. The park was a long rectangle, sort of hidden between the streets and behind houses. It had 2 entrances. The one we used, and what we called the back entrance, led onto a residential street, and the front entrance, which had a long driveway leading up to an old chapel, which was now a karate school. Sometimes cars would drive down there and use it as a safe place to turn around and head back onto the main road if they had missed a turn. The park had a long path running through it with trees on either side. To the left was a nice walkway with a garden full of all sorts of flowers growing there and benches to sit on and a few trees to climb. To the right was a decent-sized field with a fenced-off play area. This area was near the karate school and driveway. Sometimes when we were in the park, there would be a few other people either walking their dogs or playing football and kids playing in the play area. Sometimes it would just be quiet, not another soul around, just me, my dad, and Oscar walking through the park. This particular Friday afternoon was a quiet one. As soon as we entered the park, I checked to see if anyone was in the play area. When I saw that it was empty, I jumped at the chance to get on a swing before anyone else showed up. I told my dad that I was going to play on the swings, and before he could even answer me, I was already running up the field. My dad just called after me to be careful and said that he'd be over by the flowers. I got to the swings and must have been on them for no more than 10 minutes when I heard a car pull up from the driveway and turn around. My back was to the karate school, but I never bothered looking behind me. I heard a car door open, and I thought it was maybe the owner of the school opening up a little early. It was no big deal, so I just carried on swinging. I then heard the squeaky gate of the play area open up, and all of a sudden there's this woman standing behind me smiling. It was a closed smile. I stopped swinging as fast as I could. There was just something about her smile that made me feel uncomfortable. "Hello," she said, but I didn't answer her. I looked around to see where her kids were, and I realized that she didn't have any with her, which I thought was odd. I then looked behind her towards her car, and now I'm starting to feel panicked, and I'm not entirely sure why, but her driver's seat door was wide open and the engine was still running. It was a big car with a burnt orange color. It kind of reminded me of the type of cars from shows in the 70s. The woman then stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the car, and then spoke. "Are you here alone?" she asked. I answered her this time by saying something like, "I'm walking the dog with my dad, and they're over there." I pointed behind me to the opposite side of the park where the flowers were, but something made me keep my eye contact with her. I didn't turn to point. I also realized that my dad may not be able to see me because of the trees along the path. I also wanted to keep an eye out on the car as best as I could, even though she was blocking me. The woman looked up in the direction and stretched her neck to exaggerate her action. "I don't see them, sweetheart. Perhaps your daddy forgot about you and went home. If you're lost, I can take you to the police station." I remember everything she said to me and how she pronounced her words, especially how she called me sweetheart. I still cringe to this day if anyone calls me that. She then took a step closer, still smiling at me, but this time it was an open smile, but it looked forced. At this point, Oscar came over to the gate and barked, and I heard my dad call his name, and he was close. The woman stopped smiling, and I looked up. I jumped from the swing and ran out to the gate, straight to my dad. I heard the woman run out of the gate and towards her car. My dad must have seen how scared I was, as he didn't even need to ask me anything. He just shouted after the woman and then ran after her. I then ran after my dad and caught up with him as he had stopped by the top of the driveway. I looked down to see the car turning left onto the road. I remember the look on my dad's face. It was a mixture of anger and fear, and I remember his fists. They were clenched so tight that his knuckles turned white. He picked me up, squeezed me tightly, and then carried me all the way home. My dad called the police, but no one came to take a statement as nothing had happened. Jump to 10 years later, and me, my dad, my mom, and a new brother and a new dog are walking through the same park on a Sunday afternoon. My brother asks if he can go out and play on the climbing frame as he can see a friend of his is there. My mom says that she will go with him. As they're walking off, I suddenly say to my dad, "Hey, do you remember that creepy lady?" My dad stopped mid-step and clenched his fists, and he had that mixed look of anger and fear again. Very slowly, he began to say, "There's something I've never told you about that day. When the car was driving off, there was a man in the back seat. He looked at me. He looked me square in the eyes and smiled. It was a horrid, spiteful smile, and it scared me. I knew right then that they were trying to take you, and he was letting me know how close they had gotten to doing so. That's why I didn't get the number plate. I just couldn't take my eyes off of him." We moved from that area a year later. God only knows what would have happened or could have happened to me that day if I didn't have any wits about me.
First, for those of you who don't know, a holler or hollow is another word for a dirt or gravel road. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, my dad was in a nearly fatal car accident, which really fucked up his back. He was in hospital for 2 months and had frequent doctor visits for almost a year after that. Because our family lived 45 minutes out in the country, and my dad had to go into town for his appointments, sometimes 2 to 3 times a week, we moved in with my paternal grandparents. They lived about 10 minutes from town, but across state lines, so obviously out of my school district. This meant I had to switch schools. This wasn't a big deal because I'd been to this school before when my parents temporarily split up. About a month after we're settled in is when my grandpa stopped driving my little sister and I down to the bus stop. Our mum was usually up and down all night with our little sister, who was only a few months old, so she didn't get up to drive us either. Our nana wouldn't drive in the dark unless it was an emergency, and our dad was disabled, so we had to walk. It was just down our holler, which was maybe an 8-minute walk. This didn't bother us, except for in the mornings because it was still dark when we left home, and we lived in a heavily wooded area. One morning my sister and I are walking to catch our bus. We were just reaching the end of the holler when a black SUV pulls in like a bat out of hell. The driver slams on the brake and the SUV comes to a stop about 15 feet in front of us. It happened so quickly that I didn't understand what was going on yet. So I just stood there for a long moment, confused. I didn't want to run and this ended up being something innocent. My sister and I had come home before because we got scared of sounds in the woods, and we got scolded because my parents thought we just didn't want to go to school. So I didn't want to miss the bus unless I had to. I grabbed my little sister's hand when I heard the door click open. I could barely see because the guy had his brights on, but I was ready to run. He then walks around to the front of the SUV, and I can barely see that he's dressed in all black and has a ski mask on. He starts to run at us, just as I hear our buses a few stops away. It's far enough away though, that this guy has time to grab us and get away before the bus is even close. So I quickly picked up my sister and ran as fast as I possibly could back to the house. I looked back when I heard the bus stop. I guess the driver thought we were waiting in the vehicle or something. Just as the bus pulls in, the guy screeches back onto the road in the opposite direction he came from. Our mum called the police and the school, but nothing ever became of it. The police just told her to watch us more closely. Now that I'm an adult, it still bothers me. This was planned, and I know it. First, our holler is kind of hidden, so it wasn't just like some guy drove down the road and saw a couple of kids and decided to take them. The timing was perfect. He knew when we'd get to the end of the holler, and when the bus would arrive. He showed up in the gap of time when we were alone, and most vulnerable. And most obviously, he was dressed in all black and was wearing a ski mask. Not to mention he tried to grab us. I often wonder how long he'd been watching us and learning our morning routine while we were completely unaware. It makes me wonder if there's someone watching me now and I don't know about it. So, creepy SUV guy, I'm not sure what your plans for us were, nor do I want to know. So let's not meet.
So, I work in the service industry, beauty, body, etc. A few years ago, there was a very strange, very creepy client we had who came in for a series of treatments, which meant me and 3 other girls would see him several times a week. He would come in for the latest appointment possible and bring weird books about lucid dreaming and strip down to nothing but a towel over his junk, even though his treatments didn't require him being nude. We all agreed that he was a complete weirdo, and after a few weeks we were free from his crazy ass. So fast forward to this past winter. He calls in out of the blue and says he wants to start these treatments again. I begged my boss not to have him come in, but there really wasn't a reason not to have him. Plus, he was in his early 20s, a rich kid who spent all of his mom's money. As he was speaking to me over the phone, he remembered everything about me and began apologizing for being rude to me in the past, which he wasn't, he was just a freak. And he said that he had a huge crush on me and blah blah blah. For the first few treatments, my coworker would be with me, but after a few weeks she couldn't work that late anymore, so I was alone. He constantly tried to keep me in the room with him, first asking questions about the treatment, but then trying to pry into my personal life. He kept complimenting my body and looks, to which I politely said it wasn't appropriate, and he'd apologize. On more than one occasion, he was definitely high out of his mind, and not on weed, and would say the weirdest things. This all doesn't sound too bad, but if you could picture what a serial killer would have been like from the movies and TV, that was this guy. I'm not even joking, he was the scariest person I've ever met in my life. The day I finally had enough was this one day when he came in wearing a suit. During the treatment, he complimented me over and over, and then began asking me how I felt about women being raped and murder, and saying that women were horrible and such. I became increasingly nervous, and he would laugh and try to contain his laughter while talking about rape and murder. I can't even remember what he said because I was so scared I blanked everything. After his treatment was done, I immediately called him a cab. He would usually ask me to do it, but I did it way earlier than he would ever have asked me. Just before he left, he said, "I find it adorable that you're so vulnerable." And he stood there staring at me with, honestly, the coldest look in his eyes and a slight smirk. I literally almost started bawling my eyes out right in front of him. I could feel my heart racing and I was sweating profusely. Before he left, he said he forgot something in the room and stood there waiting for me to get it for him. If I had gone into that room, he could have easily followed behind me and blocked the doorway. I could have easily been trapped in there after 8 p.m. in the winter when it's very dark out. The streets around here are dead around that time, and the other tenants in this building always leave around 5 or 6. He just stood there, staring at me as I sat at my desk, literally clutching a pair of scissors away from his view, waiting for him to go in and get whatever it was he forgot. He grabbed the item and then asked me to help him clean up, to which I obviously said no and locked the door as he was gone. I watched him get into his cab and then ran to my car, literally crying the hardest I've ever cried in my adult life. He called for several days and tried to explain to my coworker that he thought he scared me and wanted to apologize. I never spoke to him and told my boss of what happened, to which she banned him from returning. I don't know if he would have actually attempted anything, but I think the fact that I called the cab earlier without him asking, he knew that someone would have been outside, so maybe that deterred him. So, weird, creepy potential serial killer, I hope we never ever meet again.
This happened to my mum 3 years ago. Before I go on, a little backstory is necessary. I grew up in a small rural town. My family are apple growers. In fact, I'm the 7th generation of my family to grow up on the family orchard. Our property is located on a mountainside, and our orchards go all the way up from the main road to the edge of the thick woods that cover the mountain. My neighbours are my grandparents on one side, and my great aunt and uncle on the other. It all started on a sunny Saturday afternoon. As she usually does, my mum took her horse out for some exercise. She usually rides all the way up to the woods until she reaches the old scout's cabin, and then back down past the sugar shack. On this particular day, she chose to come down the path that borders my great-uncle's property. There's a large pond there where a heron lives, among other creatures, and it's actually quite picturesque. As she looks towards the pond, however, she saw a hunched-over figure shuffling along the trees. At first she thought it was probably John Boy. This was the affectionate nickname she gave to the old man who my family employed to help us around the farm. He was rather eccentric but harmless. Worrying he might be injured, she began to move toward him. As she got closer, she remembered that John Boy had left for the weekend, and that this couldn't possibly be him. She continued towards the figure, wondering if it was perhaps a lost hiker. That's when the figure emerged from the trees onto the path. It was a young man, but it was hard to give him an age because his face was covered with rags. He was bare-chested, and his pale skin was covered in scratches and sores. My mum yelled out to him, but he didn't respond. She continued towards him, but then suddenly stopped. In his hand, dragging behind him, was an axe. Around his waist was a rope tied to a duffel bag dragging behind him. She felt very threatened at this point, and the horse had become spooked as well. She took a bit more distance from him, and called out again. "Hey, are you alright?" Faint, incoherent grumblings came back as a reply. He wasn't even looking at her. She made a final attempt to make contact, but then he just started making a loud, guttural yell. She told him to get off the property and directed him towards the main road. She rode back towards our house, intending to call the police. Halfway there, she realized that the path he was taking would lead him directly to my great-uncle's house. My great-aunt was an avid gardener and was out gardening that day. She turned the horse around and hightailed it to their house. Both my great-uncle and great-aunt were out on the porch, enjoying lemonade. She quickly told them what was going on and asked them to go inside, lock the doors, and call the police. My great-aunt did so, but not my great-uncle. No, not him. He just boldly declared, "I'm going to go talk to him." Before my mum could say anything, he was in his truck and driving up along the path. He intercepted him halfway up the path. He drove alongside him and rolled down his window. "Are you lost?" he asked. The young man didn't look at him and instead kept shuffling down the path. My great-uncle repeated himself. "With Dad. In woods," was all my great-uncle could discern from the man's grumblings. "What's your name?" he then asked. "Dad always liked animals. Happy. With animals now. Better," was the response. There was something incredibly unsettling about the young man's responses. My great-uncle, now sufficiently spooked, directed him towards the main road as well and drove back. When he came back and told his story, the consensus was that there was probably a dead body in the woods. They called the police and waited. When the police arrived, the young man was nowhere to be found. They searched the woods, but luckily found no body. What they did find was still quite unsettling. They found multiple instances of hares and skunks, hacked to bits and half-eaten. They told my family to call them if anything further happened. The following week in the local paper, there was an article about a mentally disturbed young man who was found along the side of a highway near my town. He'd been missing for over 3 months and had run away from a halfway house, where, unbeknownst to his caregivers, he had stopped taking his medication. We never saw him again. But just in case, creepy axe man, let's not meet. If you made it this far, then thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed the video. I'd like to give a big shout out to Rainbot Horror. She helped me narrate some of the stories this episode and was a really big help, and she does some great stuff on her channel, which I really recommend checking out. You can follow the links in the description to her channel, or if you're not bored of my voice yet, you can click on the screen and follow a link to one of my videos. I'd also like to thank everybody who's been sending their stories in to me to read out. Obviously I could only use a couple of them in this video, but keep sending them in because who knows, maybe in the next video I'll read that one out. You can support this channel by liking, sharing and subscribing. If you want, you can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, the links are also in the description below. So until my next video guys, take care, and remember, the best things happen in the dark.